recruits or even plan or train for their next attack. Terrorist use of the digital gaming space is not limited to one group or ideology. There is a broad range of terrorist and violent extremist actors and their supporters active on these platforms, especially those motivated by xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance. Al-Qaeda and Daesh, for instance, developed video games adapted from popular first-person shooter games. The situation has gone from bad to worse during the COVID-19 pandemic, as a growing number of people, especially young people, have come to spend more time online for entertainment and social interaction. All the anxieties and frustrations associated with the pandemic have provided a fertile ground for conspiracy theories, hate speech, and violent extremist propaganda to spread online and offline all around the world. Such exploitation of the digital gaming space transcends national borders by its very nature and can only be addressed through multilateral and multi-stakeholder cooperation with the industry, academia, think tanks, and civil society. This has become a matter of great and urgent international concern given the sheer number of online users, including millions and millions of young women and men active in this largely unmonitored space. Some good initiatives have started, such as the launch in October of an Extremism and Gaming Research Network by the Royal United Services Institute, or the efforts of the European Union's Radicalization Awareness Network. However, there's a lack of global policy dialogue and discussion on this topic, and a dearth of systematic, programmatic approaches to address this threat. And without appropriate action, terrorists and violent extremists will continue exploiting the digital gaming space. We also need to have a better picture of the positive aspects of gaming. We need to know more about the resilience and prosocial benefits that these networks and communities can have. We know, for example, that there are already gamers and gaming platforms that are speaking out against narratives of hate and division, and we need to harness that in our efforts. This is why the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism has convened this expert roundtable today as a starting point to expand our engagement, including through our capacity building efforts to address digital gaming spaces and their adjacent platforms. We have a full and exciting lineup of experts with us, including behavioral and psychological experts that will share insights and the latest research on this topic. We will hear from members of academia, civil society, the private sector, and members of the gaming community itself. We hope to foster a rich and diverse dialogue on the intersection between video games and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. We'll also help inform a high-level event that we will organize at the beginning of 2022 as a next step towards a coherent, inclusive, and multilateral response to a critical emerging terrorist threat. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to invite you to view a brief video presentation on this topic.
Online gaming spaces allow users to immerse themselves in well-crafted digital worlds, narrative-driven experiences, and online competitions. These spaces are cross-cutting, allowing 2.7 billion gamers from different age groups, genders, and nationalities to come together in what is now one of the world's most widely enjoyed pastimes. With the growing popularity of video games and their increased interaction with social media content creators and other online communities, such as live streaming platforms and discussion boards, a significant online gaming culture with its own communication ecosystems and subcultures has emerged. These emerging cultures further developed during the COVID-19 pandemic as society shifted relationships, social lives, and work environments to the online space. Many have found solace, connections, and new friends through gaming and gaming-adjacent platforms. The reach and influence of video games has never been greater, as new technologies such as augmented and virtual reality enhance video games. This impact is projected to multiply and become increasingly ingrained in everyday life. This presents a unique security challenge as terrorists and violent extremists are capitalizing on the growing use of digital spaces to recruit, fundraise, radicalize, and disseminate extremist propaganda. While there is limited existing research, we know that terrorists have created new games, modified existing ones, and are exploiting gaming culture by embedding rhetoric and messaging used to recruit and promote violent extremism in gaming spaces. Furthermore, terrorists have used gaming-adjacent platforms to spread ideologies by streaming propagandized content and utilizing aspects of gaming culture to encourage acts of violence. In addition, terrorists have adopted gaming language, set up video game-style competitions, and live-streamed attacks in a manner reminiscent of first-person shooter games. As research has yet to indicate whether these methods are an effective means of radicalization, the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism and its UNCT Center have launched an initiative to further explore the nexus between gaming and violent extremism. This initiative consists of a three-part research and consultation project. During Phase 1, consultants were engaged to provide an expert report on a literature review. After examining the findings, Phase 2 was developed to help fill gaps in existing knowledge through a series of surveys and focus groups that incorporated viewpoints of current gaming culture. In Phase 3's expert roundtable, the research team from Phases 1 and 2 will present their preliminary findings. To further explore the topic, UNOCT's External Partnerships section has brought together a panel of experts from different segments of society to reflect on the findings and provide their sector's unique insights through informative panel discussions aimed at better understanding and safeguarding against this growing exploitation. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the Expert Roundtable on Video Games and Violent Extremism.
Thank you. I would now like to introduce Dr. Amarnath Amarsingham and Ms. Linda Schlegel, our lead researchers on this topic. Dr. Amarnath Amarsingham, who is an assistant professor in the School of Religion and is cross-appointed to the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University, Ontario, Canada. He's also a senior fellow with the International Center for the Study of Radicalization. Queen's University. And Ms. Linda Schlegel from Goethe University, Frankfurt, and an associate fellow at both the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt, and Center for Applied Research on De-Radicalization in Berlin. She is also a founding member of the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, or EGRN, and has worked on the use of gamification and gaming-adjacent platforms by extremist actors, as well as the potential benefits of using gaming contents in preventing and countering extremism. Since Ms. Schlegel is not feeling well, Dr. Amarsingham will deliver both presentations. Doctor, the screen is yours.
Brian, thanks everyone for joining from your various time zones. I'm just going to share screen here quickly. And just to provide a bit of a background on the early results of some of the studies that we're looking at in terms of the intersection between gaming and extremism. As you saw in the video, it's kind of a global phenomenon at the moment. Gaming culture is quite large, and much like any other platform, it's also being exploited or trying to be exploited by various extremist actors. And so three of the ways in which that's happening is, and we'll get into whether how prevalent this is in a moment, but I think one of the things that's happening is, of course, a lot of these extremist groups are trying to develop their own games, and so you've seen first-person shooter games developed by extremist groups themselves. You're also seeing the use of existing video games as well as modifying existing video games. The most famous one quite recently was The Sims was a game within The Sims was changed to reflect the Christchurch shooting, so you could actually take up a weapon and pretend to be the Christchurch shooter. And so there is a kind of modification process going on with existing video games as well. And much like with other social media platforms, there is a in-game chat function on a lot of these platforms, which is being used or attempting to be used by violent extremist actors as well. Number three, there's a kind of broader use of digital gaming culture by some of these extremist groups. Gaming platforms like Discord, Twitch, DLive are being used by a lot of these extremist groups in the far right as well as jihadist groups. Gaming cultural references, of course, are making their way into extremist propaganda. There was you might have seen kind of more famous ones like you can sit at your home and play Call of Duty, or you can come and respond to the real Call of Duty. The choice is yours. So gaming references are used by extremist groups to get their message across. There's also the gamification of violence. One of the attacks, for example, is kind of the Vegas attack, where we know that they found, bullet trajectories and things like that on a notepad next to the attack. And so there's a kind of virtual scoreboards and achievements and manifestos that are being talked about, a kind of gamification of the attack itself, which is happening. Of course, much of this gaming content is also making its way into other platforms like Telegram and the Chans. One of the kind of research gaps that we tried to focus on with this pilot project was to ask experts and to ask gamers themselves, what are some of the trends that you're seeing? What are the gaps that you're seeing in the research? And the main thing that they spoke about, of course, is that we have a long-running debate about the relationship between gaming and violence in general. Most of you will remember after the Columbine school shootings, there was a huge public debate about the role of video games and how it might be pushing people into violence, which resulted also in a whole lot of research around the relationship between violence and gaming. But what we're looking at here is the relationship more specifically between extremist content or hate speech and the intersection of that with violent extremism. And I think that research is still very much in its infancy. A lot of it is anecdotal research or case study based and still lacks a kind of broader systemic research component. We also have very little idea of the prevalence of the extremist content in these gaming spaces. Again, there's obviously a lot of talk about these games that are being modified, these games that are being used by extremist groups, but we don't have a clear sense of the extent of it across different gaming spaces. And I'll come back to this in a moment because this is something we focus on in our focus group discussions as well. The other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that much like we saw in the video, gaming is global. It is not a homogenous community. The gaming community is much like any other online community, massively diverse, and come at this from very different angles, which invites the question of what do we do about this problem, right? What kind of counteractions can be put in place? What kind of countermeasures can be put in place? And this led to some of the early focus groups pointing out some of the gaps in how people approach this issue. A lot of terrorism experts or a lot of countering violent extremism practitioners aren't gamers, don't actually have gaming experience. And a lot of gamers who are working in this space to kind of make the gaming culture better also don't come at it from a violent extremism perspective. And so I think part of it is bridging those two different communities and those two different efforts together, which I hope events like this will start to do. Some of the gaps that gamers pointed out in terms of what violent extremism scholars don't understand, of course, is that it's largely a subcultural movement. The gaming community is a subcultural community. It's massively diverse, as I mentioned, and so even understanding this broader community has been a challenge for people who aren't immersed in it. There's also a push, I think, or we were pushed to at least look at some of the positive aspects of gaming as well, that the sense of community that people are experiencing and other benefits, which I'll come back to as well. There's also a problem of how to approach the gaming communities. Some of these communities are largely insular, difficult to kind of navigate from a research perspective. And so how do you actually fill some of these research gaps is a kind of ongoing question, I think, that we can explore, and hopefully this roundtable will also think about. There is a risk assessment component as well. Much like with radicalization research in general, we don't really recognize or really know how gaming fits into the larger ecosystem of radicalization to violence, what role it plays within all of the other factors that we know might push people into violence. And so there's a kind of need to understand where gaming fits into this kind of larger ecosystem of violence. So that's kind of the background. We moved into trying to understand that question through a kind of pilot study, which contained 3 phases. One of them was to basically understand the larger landscape of research in this space between the relationship between gaming and violence, as well as gaming and extremism. So we did a large lit review based on some of the findings. We engaged in several focus groups with experts in the field, largely people who were studying extremism in the gaming space, in the gaming world, to try to understand some of the gaps that they're noticing, some of the trends that they're noticing, etc. All of those insights were fed into 2 focus groups we conducted with gamers themselves, which we completed last week. And the so a lot of those insights were then fed into phase 3, which is beginning this week, of trying to survey gamers around the world to try to get a sense of some of the trends that they're seeing, some of the problems that they're seeing, and how we might fix some of that stuff. And so that's kind of the quick overview of the pilot study. As I mentioned, phase 1 and 2 are complete, and we're moving into phase 3 at the moment. And so some of the research questions that came up in phase 1 and 2 that we are now incorporating into phase 3. One of them, of course, is the resonance problem. We know that there's a lot of extremist content out there on all platforms, not just gaming platforms, but we really have a kind of poor understanding of why some of this content is resonating with certain individuals, right? And this is true for extremism across platforms. Just because certain extremist propaganda is out there doesn't mean people are responding to it equally, doesn't mean that across platforms are responding to it in the same way. And so we need to understand kind of why certain messages are resonating at certain times. We assume, again, that the use of video games platforms have some sort of impact, but it's not clear what some of that impact might be yet. We know that ISIS, groups like ISIS and groups associated with the far right are on these platforms, but we don't know, or we're starting to understand how these platforms actually impact young people. The second thing that was quite clear in the focus groups was that there is a harmful component to these gaming platforms. It's not all about extremism, though. There is a kind of larger culture of male toxicity, masculine toxicity, misogyny, dark humor, that is part of the online gaming community. Again, we don't know the extent of it or how prevalent it is. I'll come back to this as well. We spoke about it with the phase 2 focus groups quite extensively. We also don't know what ideologies are most prevalent, right? We don't know whether it's right-wing jihadists or incels or other ideologies that are more prevalent on these spaces than others. And so, again, a kind of understudied phenomenon there. And the question of whether games are a kind of starting point down the rabbit hole, this came up in the focus groups somewhat, is that because gaming platforms are largely young people, very, very young people, is this the kind of starting point down other pathways that could lead to radicalization, to violence? And as I mentioned, the kind of how this fits into the larger process of radicalization in general is still quite understudied. The focus groups also focused or kind of urged us to look at some of the pro-social benefits of gaming. This came up over and over again. It provides an environment for kind of out-of-box thinking, creative problem solving for a lot of these young people. There's, of course, an opportunity for community. One thing that a lot of focus group participants said was it's sometimes not even about the game that's being played, but it's about the playing, right? It's about the community the community of people that are around this game. So you could basically take out one game and replace it with another, and it's generally the kind of value that people are receiving from these online communities that we need to keep in mind. There's, of course, a opportunity for connection. One of the things that was made clear to us was that there is an already vibrant debate within the gaming community about issues around inclusion, diversity, disability, gender issues, etc., largely stemming as a consequence of the 2014 Gamergate issue, which I'll come back to as well. And so for people wanting to work in CVE in the gaming space, it's beneficial to try to work with these trends that are already in place, these groups that are already in place within these environments to get to potentially have some buy-in there. There's the other kind of positive benefit, of course, is that it helps a lot of young people who are struggling with certain issues live in this online community anonymously. Sometimes people struggling with gender fluidity, people struggling with social anxiety are able to kind of navigate these online communities, sometimes anonymously with their videos off, and kind of build skills and build friendships and communities that way. And so there are kind of added benefits to the online gaming community that focus group participants wanted us to make sure to include. Again, for phase 2, we did 2 focus groups. I'll quickly go through some of the main findings there. Both focus groups engaged in a very vibrant debate about what it means to be a gamer and the ways in which this identity is reinforced. People pointed out that video games largely were pushed into the mainstream by the US military, for example, because they wanted to use these games to basically recruit members, and so they didn't intend, of course, to create a platform for potential extremists, but they did, as one participant said, they did intend to create a boys' club, right? And so there was a kind of intention by members of the U.S. military to create a community of gaming that could help them in some form or another, and so this idea was not an accident. I think the consequences were large, weren't foreseen, but there is a kind of movement there to understand where this came from and some of the unintended consequences of it going forward. The second thing that's related to gaming culture, gaming identity, is that a lot of young people, at least in the early days, felt that they had sacrificed something for this gaming identity. They were bullied at school, they were outcast at school, they were made fun of at school, and so they were kind of attached to this gaming identity through a struggle, through suffering, through having put some skin in the game. Whereas now with gaming going very, very mainstream, they feel like a lot of these new people who are coming into these spaces haven't paid their dues, right? And so there's a kind of attempt to delimit what it means to be a gamer and who's part of the in-group and who's not. And so those debates are, at least from a couple of years ago, very vibrant and starting to change now. The other thing they pointed out was there has been a lot of improvement in the things that we're concerned about with misogyny, hate speech, extremism, violence, et cetera, over the last 5 years. Many gamers, they noted, are actually ashamed of the 2014 Gamergate saga, which was, for those of you who don't know, a kind of harassment campaign that largely targeted women, sent them death threats, threats of rape, etc. And it was largely a kind of movement against progressive currents that were happening in the gaming community. And so this kind of push was very vibrant in the 2014 saga, and I think a lot of current gamers are pushing back against that trend as well. The other thing they noticed was that a lot of developers themselves are starting to see, because this is a money-making enterprise, that that just advertising or just making games that appeal to young white men is probably not a great idea long term, especially as gaming goes global, that there is a financial incentive to making these spaces a bit more safe for diverse players and so on. And so there are kind of positive trends coming about on that front. Again, one of the things that came up over and over again is it's all about community. It's all about the benefits and social benefits that these young people are getting from being involved in these communities. As one of them said, we get the same benefits that the bad guys get, right? It's that that they're part of this online community that that is very important to them. As one participant said, she was in and out of hospital when she was younger, and being able to kind of enter this online community from her hospital bed or from her bed at home, and enter into this global community of players was enormously beneficial during this kind of difficult period in her life. And I think with the COVID pandemic, many people also stuck at home also experience that kind of broad international or transnational benefit. The one of the other things they noted, and this is, and I'll end with one after this, is that the structure of the game actually matters when we're talking about extremism. That not all games are conducive to hate speech or violence or extremism in the same way. A game like Minecraft, for example, you have to go and look for, largely go and look for extremist content. It doesn't just kind of you don't just stumble on it. Whereas other platforms, you could just kind of be playing it and stumble on more far right spaces or hate speech. Other companies like Nintendo are a little bit better at takedowns and moderating these platforms compared to other gaming companies, because they recognize, I think, that they have very, very young people on their platforms, and if they allow hate speech and violence to kind of spread on their platform, it's not going to go well for them financially. And so much like the gaming community is diverse, the gaming companies and games are also diverse in the way that they're structured and could be conducive to different kinds of extremism. The other thing we were curious about from phase one research was how prevalent some of this content was. If you just started gaming, how quickly could you stumble on extremist content? And the responses kind of surprised me, because one of the things they said was that if you were in a Discord lobby, it would only take about 30 seconds for someone to call you a slur, and so it is kind of prevalent in terms of how quickly some of this stuff is accessed. But they noted that their own experiences is much more curated. So they don't just they only play with people they know. They play by themselves, and so on. And so because of this kind of not wanting to be exposed to this content, individuals are largely curating their own gaming experience, taking a kind of proactive measure to limit what they see and so on. But they also noted that it's actually they're in the minority, right? The games that ask you to play with strangers are way more popular. The games that kind of provide that experience with strangers are way more popular, and so the people that curate their experience are probably in the minority. So as I said, we're moving into phase 3, and stay tuned for findings. We're taking a kind of snowball approach within our trusted circles, within trusted networks and gaming organizations, to spread the survey as far and wide as possible. If you're able to help with this in some way, please let us know in terms of spreading the survey around. But I'll leave it there and pass it back to Mr. Rafi Shah. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Dr. Amra Singham?
Yep.
Thanks. Thank you, Undersecretary General Mr. Gregorian, and Deputy Undersecretary General Mr. Gregorian, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. And I would like to thank Mr. Amra Singham for presenting his and Mr. Shelgel's finding, which will help guide this expert roundtable. It is my pleasure to now introduce the first session on understanding the motivation and misuse of gaming exploitation. UN Office of Counter-Terrorism, given its policy leadership, coordination, and capacity building mandate on counterterrorism, will continue to remain at the forefront of emerging terrorist threat in order to support member states, civil society, and the tech sector to address the spread of violent extremist ideologies offline and online. A broad range of stakeholders across governments, civil society, the private sector, but also the United Nations and other multilateral organizations have voiced concern over terrorist misuse of digital space, including dissemination of foreign extremist narratives, incitement, recruitment, communication, and planning. This was a major area of discussion focused during the second UN Counter-Terrorism Week held earlier this year. In the digital gaming space, there are instances of game servers, chat rooms, and message boards used by terrorists, which remains largely unmonitored. Terrorist groups have modified existing video games or created their own. Some, like the perpetrators of terrorist attacks in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019, have also gamified reality and physical violence by broadcasting their attacks in video game style first person live feeds, as Mr. Amrasingham noted. As recently in January 2019, Daesh used Telegram groups to provide supporters with specific instructions for how to use gaming platforms to recruit new members. The use of video games is a sufficiently prominent recruitment strategy that a member of a Daesh Deep Web forum recently requested. He emphasized that the Flame of War 2 propaganda game be permitted to run on PlayStation portable devices. On a separate, in a separate direction, we also cannot ignore impact of terrorists buying virtual property, potentially buying virtual property, and using that to promote their objectives. Evidence of casual association between playing video games and violent extremism is still rare. Most existing studies do not point towards a casual link between uh, playing video games and instances of physical violence. Indeed, the billions of gamers are responsible and peaceful citizens. However, the growing prevalence of terrorist and violent extremist activity in these spaces must be recognized, better understood, prevented, and countered. It puts a particular risk children and youth who tend to have an affinity toward video games and digital social networks and are developing their identities, cognitive capacities, and emotional intelligence. That is why this expert roundtable is so timely, and we look forward to the session that will explore the misuse of gaming platform and the motivation behind it. The initial research findings presented earlier provide a solid basis for this discussion and to identify knowledge gaps. We need to better understand whether and what role video games could play, small or large, in mobilizing people to support or even perpetrate terrorist and extremist violence. What are the individuals and collective dynamics? How does exposure to terrorist content or actors in the video gaming space interplay with other factors? This is critical to provide evidence-based policies, programming, and tailored responses. Today, we have convened an expert panel bringing together the private sector, civil society organizations, public sector, and academia to help drive valuable insight in the digital gaming space. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alok Kanodia, psychiatrist, co-founder of Healthy Gamer, Mr. Galen Lamper England, Research and Insight Director, Love Frankie, Dr. Ahmed Al Ravi, Assistant Professor, Simon Fraser University, and Ms. Jessica Marasa, Senior Director, Global Law Enforcement, Twitch. I look forward to the insights that our expert panel will provide, including on the features of violent extremist and terrorist activity on the gaming platform, as well as how we can benefit from behavioral insights to counter this threat, an area that could be further explored through UN Office of Counter-Terrorism's International Hub on Behavioral Insights in Doha. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator, Dr. Rachel Covert, Research Director at Take This, a nonprofit organization that is helping to change the way we view the impact of video games on mental health. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Covert. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really happy to be here this morning to discuss with this esteemed panel the motivations behind and the current state of gaming exploitation and extremism. Before we begin, I'd like to remind the audience that if you have any questions, you can submit them by using the chat function. It should be on the bottom right of your screen, and there will be there's a slated time for Q&A later today. So since we only have a few minutes, 30-ish minutes or so, I'd like to go ahead and get the discussion started. And I'm going to pose the first question to Dr. Conjola, Dr. K. If you'd like to open this discussion with us about how do terrorists identify vulnerabilities and exploit them to radicalize potential targets?
Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here. So let's just dive right in. So like Dr. Cowart mentioned, how do terrorists identify vulnerabilities and exploit them to radicalize potential targets? So I think that if you look at the gaming community as a whole, there are many people in the gaming community who are in some way misfits to society. So these may be people who have been, bullied when growing up. They may not perform very well in school. They may have difficulties socializing. They may be not able to retain jobs, or some of them have dropped out of college. So I think that there are a lot of people who are in some ways a misfit to society. And so I think what online extremist groups do is sort of recognize that there's a particular group of people who are vulnerable in some way. And a big part of the radicalization process is to take that gamer's individual circumstance and start blaming it on an external factor. Oh, your life isn't going really well because this problematic institution or these kinds of people. This is where a lot of the racism comes in. This is where a lot of the misogyny comes in. And essentially they're taking a group of people who have been somewhat misfits to society or aren't able to integrate and telling them it's not your fault, it's these people's fault. And so then what they start to do is take all of that internal emotion, all of that resentment, and direct it towards a particular group of people, which then starts the process of online radicalization.
That makes sense. And it really plays into, I think, what we heard in the presentation a minute ago, where he said games can help people who are struggling feel capable. So it also plays into that, you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it gives them a sense of purpose and meaning, and now we're fighting for something.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And Ahmed, would you have something to add to that?
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for this. I think Dr. Conjola has covered almost all my points, which is, I'm not sure I've left with anything to add here. Just maybe to say that they often use emotional appeals to attract mostly to young people, and they provide them these types of incentives like imagined awards, like, listen, if you join, then you get awarded by being part of a group. And that's, by the way, one way of radicalizing people, by giving them a sense of a collective identity, that you will have a more meaningful life if you join. So that could be one way of radicalizing people. What else? They offer psychological mental support, sometimes one-on-one, and this often happens on mobile apps. So they start with the gaming community, but they end up maybe FaceTiming or on Skype, giving them a lot of attention, which is sometimes this is what they actually need, especially, adding to what Dr. Conjola mentioned about lack of sense of purpose, sometimes issues with identity. And this is, I believe, one very important thing. A lot of immigrant groups living in the West, a lot of the members of the immigrant group, especially younger generations, have that sense of lack of sense of identity, whether they don't know sometimes whether they belong to the West or belong to their original homelands. And that's a vulnerability that some of the radical groups exploit. I just want to add another type of exploitation when it comes to actually the sites themselves. These terrorist groups, they also exploit the vulnerabilities of the sites themselves, not only the people, but the sites. like social media as well as the online community. So they try to, they conduct what I call combing operations. They try to see the vulnerabilities of these sites and see whether there are any kind of lack of moderation policies. And this way they can disseminate their messages. And from there, they could probably potentially attract some people.
Yeah, absolutely. Look for the weakest link and then and then infiltrate that way, right? I'll pose this next question then to you, Ahmed, because you already kind of touched on it. So, what do we know about what the most prominent narratives are currently being used by extremists, on the internet, social media, gaming spaces, gaming adjacent spaces, Twitch, that sort of thing, for recruitment and radicalization?
Thank you again, Rachel. I think the sense of victimhood is an important narrative. We found this in our study of the far right in Canada, as well as among Islamist terrorist groups. So representing them as victims of a larger system that is meant to inflict harm on them is one very appealing narrative.
Yeah.
So usually they invoke sometimes some types of narratives about religious or political persecution, and from there they can appeal to larger audiences. Also, they use sectarian, very divisive, very polarized narratives in order to show that the others are different from you. And it also gives them a sense of uniqueness, because when they do so, they will project the idea that those members are superior than the others. And this gives them some sense of comfort. So that's another narrative, as well as an incentive to join the group.
Yeah.
Scapegoating is another thing, as well as giving them a reward. Some of the narratives will be about, definitely cherry picking facts, like taking some, half facts and showing that the whole world is conspiring against the group in order to, inflict injustice on them. So again, we saw this by the far right as well as the Islamist terrorist groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of these narratives I think we can see in lots of different areas on the internet. I want to turn the questions to Ms. Marasa, because we have someone from Twitch here, which can provide unique perspective. Are you finding that there is one or two themes that are more centralized around gaming adjacent spaces, or is it just kind of running the gamut?
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for having me here. I think I'm Jessica Marasa. I run our law enforcement response team here at Twitch, so we engage with anything on kind of a counterterrorism level. I think what's most kind of pressing right now, which I'm sure everyone is aware with and watching, is that folks that do this can be platform agnostic. And so what can happen is they can move from place to place depending on where they're removed from, because it's typically you're removed from one space, you lose your voice, you'll just go to the next, because the whole point is to have your voice heard, right? So you're not really caring if that voice is heard on Twitter or on Twitch, you just want your voice heard. And so I think that's been a really interesting kind of narrative and behavioral aspect to watch and to see people come and then to try to craft that space into what they're hoping for that message to be able to hit individuals. I think we, as a service that has grown from largely gaming to everything under the sun and hosting amazing individuals like Dr. K, who have fantastic dialogues around mental health, probably one of the few streamers that I follow on our service during work. But I think that that's something that is the other aspect too, is that it is not video games anymore, that kind of label. It is social media. It is, again, where your voice can be heard. And if that voice can be heard in a podcast room, and your podcast happens to be hosting someone who's, let's say, involved with the KKK in Texas, how does that happen? And that's why, as you've seen over the past year, our hateful conduct guidelines have gotten so much stricter because of these kind of platform agnostic, and then really going and just branching out into different areas to have those dialogues. So I think the agility of being on a service side, of needing to monitor and be able to keep up with that is a narrative we've been watching.
Absolutely. And Dr. K, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight one particular movement, because I think it illustrates a lot of what we're discussing, and that is the incel movement. So I think the incel movement, which stands for involuntarily celibate, is a good example of what everyone is sort of talking about. So they have a group identity. These are people who we talked about sort of discrimination against this group, right? That there's a victimhood kind of complex. And so this is not racial discrimination. It's actually what they conceive as sexual discrimination, that all men have and it's predominantly men, but that's actually changing, have a right to have sex. And since they're being denied that right, they can use whatever means is necessary for justice. So there's a lot of sense of righteousness. If you look at manifestos written by a lot of the school shooters in the United States, they will very explicitly cite or even quote incel terminology. And so I think we're seeing a lot of, it's a good example of sort of this movement where there is identification with a particular set of principles. There's a sense of victimhood. There's also, Jessica was saying, there is a lot of platform agnostic stuff going on. So these people, Twitch has done a phenomenal job of cracking down on this kind of dialogue and behavior. So these people are just migrating to other platforms. And so I think it's just a really good example that showcases what everyone is talking about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to turn the discussion a little bit more towards gaming specific, and I'm going to come to you, Galen. What role do you think behavioral insights play in further researching the exploitation of online gaming spaces by violent extremists?
Sure. Thanks so much, Rachel. I think that's a really interesting question. I'm glad to be part of the panel here today. When we look at behavioral insights specific to gaming and gaming adjacent platforms, one thing that we've tried to unpack at the Extremism and Gaming Research Network is to look at the specificities across channels. So to pick up this conversation thread from Dr. K and from Jessica, really understanding in what ways do approaches and narratives across platforms and across different channels vary, right? What are the actual approaches and tactics that are being used? And how do those change, whether you're working on Steam, whether you're working on Twitch, if you're designing some approach in Roblox? What are the specific ways in which audiences are being reached or are not by dangerous and violent extremist actors across different channels? And shifting from looking at gaming as this broad phenomenon to specifically understanding individual communication channels inside of this space. I think that's one aspect where we can draw a lot on traditional strategic communications research, which is a lot of our bread and butter at Love Frankie, understanding how do we cut through to different audiences. And on the flip side, how do we see violent extremist organizations and hateful individuals using strategic communications approaches to reach the audiences they want? So number one, understanding behaviors by channels and by platform. Mm-hmm. Number two, a massive area that we see as a gap in research at the moment is understanding the behaviors of younger gamers, right? There's been generational pieces of research, especially 10 and 15 years ago, but those behaviors of gamers were in a very different social space, in a very different sphere for online socialization. So understanding the behaviors of younger gamers, I think, is absolutely critical at the moment, and a place that we see as being largely underexplored.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great point about tailoring the efforts towards the communication channels, because you're going to have a lot different, if it has Discord and it has all these things going around it, or if it's just specifically through the platform. And I want to turn back to you again, Jessica, because Twitch is unique in that it's live streaming. Is there some unique things to look out for when we talk about this kind of behavior through live streaming platforms specifically?
Yeah, I think to Galen's point, I think what's really interesting in looking at these behavioral insights is how they've changed over time as well. I think, and this is discussed earlier, a lot of folks come to Twitch to find community. It is a beautiful place to build community, and that can be in any which way or shape or form you choose to build that community. And much to also to go to Dr. K's point on incels originally were built, the movement of it was originally created around building community and conversation around the celibacy, involuntary celibacy. And then that turned very, very, very toxic and has become an incredibly dangerous kind of manifesto line that is, as to Dr. K's point, in almost every school shooter's manifesto at this point. Where does that change? what flips that? What turns a healthy community, or what turns you being in a community and feeling shoved out of it or feeling you don't fit? I think, neurodivergent communities too, someone that feels like they're not fitting in somewhere, they can't have the dialogue they hope to have. And if they feel then shoved out, does that flip that coin over for them behaviorally? And I think as someone who's looking for this content constantly and trying to intervene, noticing red flags, that's something that is particularly with younger folks who don't have all those social emotional skills to be able to say if they're upset or work through their hard feelings. How do we pick up on clues if something is going to happen or if they're moving towards that extremist level, so that we can avoid things like these horrific school shootings, or mass acts of violence? So I think that watching how those communities can shift from positive to negative, I think can assist us a lot in trying to catch it, because obviously our main goal is to be preventative here.
Absolutely. Dr. Khair Ahmed, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that it's challenging. So I think we have a community with, several 100,000 people in it at this point. And it's so challenging to walk the line between, if someone has, let's say, some thoughts that are kind of in a dangerous direction, do you ban them right away, or do you try to engage with them to sort of alter their course? And it's a very slippery slope, in terms of, because the more that you kind of encourage certain types of behavior, the more that people may come out of the woodwork. And we're really struggling with trying to figure out, how much do we engage with these people when they are a member of our community? I recently discovered that there is a sub server for our community for everyone who has gotten banned from our Discord server. And they've created so they're like fans of us, but they've been banned for some reason. Mm-hmm. And, so they're congregating somewhere else, and now they're creating their own echo chamber. So, it's really challenging to sort of figure out where that line is.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked about generally how recruitment works online, and a little bit about gaming specifically. So what about gaming related content? We heard in the introduction that some games are being developed specifically by extremists, some are being modded, but a lot of times these networks can be in games that are already, just pre-existing. So how can gaming related content influence this radicalization process? And what do you think are the major gateways that terrorists are using to enter this space? And I want to turn this question again to Galen.
Thanks for that. I mean, I think really in the introduction scene setting that Dr. Amara Singham and Linda really put together, I think really scopes out those three main categories, right? Whether we're looking at specific games, gaming related social spaces, or the gamification aspects. When it comes to gaming related content directly, we've seen indications that I should caveat have not been fully explored, right? We're really trying to understand the depth and breadth of this problem, which is why we're all here today. But we've seen individual approaches and attempts at recruitment and radicalization carried out on individual first-person shooter games. So we've seen members of intelligence services being targeted directly by recruiters on Counter-Strike servers, for example. So we know there's ad hoc incidents that do happen. Is that systematic? Is there a broader strategy behind it? That is unclear. We know that ad hoc events do happen that way. Mm-hmm. Some of our colleagues at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue have looked at platform-specific communications. So we've seen that on Steam, for example, there is a phenomenal amount of far-right and anti-Semitic content that actually occurs primarily on the gaming-related forums that Steam hosts. So not directly in-game, but on connected group communication platforms that are hosted separately. Mm-hmm. We know that those are both gateways that are present. Mm-hmm. But one thing we talk about a lot is this is a place where existing extremists, if you're a neo-Nazi or a member of Atomwaffen, are you going to these platforms because you enjoy gaming and you just happen to also already be an extremist? Or are you using games specifically for strategic purposes to engage in recruitment, radicalization, and grooming? Mm-hmm. So I think there's two very different angles inside of that are important for us to disentangle and understand to what extent is gaming just being used as an enjoyable social practice, and to what extent is it being used as a tactic or as a strategic device. But those are two we've seen. We also know that there are aspects related to financing online, and ways in which money laundering tactics have been adapted to use gaming in-game related purchases. I think that's another area that's really ripe for exploration, not necessarily on the radicalization side, but potentially related to financing carried out through gaming related platforms.
I mean, maybe, don't they say follow the money?
Always.
We might have lost Rachel for a
I
moment.
think we may have. Jessica, do you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. I think actually, Dr. Ahmed, we were going to look for any more insights from you on the gaming related content and radicalization processes or any other information you might have there.
Yeah, I mean, I like because my background is in media and communication. We actually, I don't want to perpetuate or promote the idea that there is some kind of like moral panic about video gaming. Actually, it's so important, it's so useful, and I think Amaranth mentioned the prosocial benefits of playing video games. But in every activity in life, in anything in social life, there will be some kind of negative aspect. So we'll definitely be highlighting these negative aspects. But it doesn't mean that this is the only thing available. So definitely there are so many good things about gaming. I'm a gamer myself. Now, talking about the content itself, I think, if you think of it philosophically here, violence is turning to be a game itself. In this way, the gamers will be desensitized in what they do. And regarding, I mean, this is again what Amaranth mentioned about the gamification of violence here regarding what they do as a game. Have a look at the Christchurch attack, how everything was done with the GoPro camera. It's like a game. ISIS did something similar. So this is definitely a very dangerous thing that is happening. And it also could be done like the first-person shooter games could be used as military training. When I examined ISIS's educational apps, I saw that they were actually using these apps directed towards children to show them, to desensitize them about violence, that they encourage them to kill, bomb things, and so on. It's like some kind of indoctrination, in other words. So that's another thing. And with regard to the other aspect of the question, where it happens, usually, again, Amaranth mentioned that. He covered a lot of things. The chat features of the video games could be a problem because we rarely know what goes on these places, as well as the social media sites associated with video games, especially mobile apps, because we have very little access. We call them the dark social, the alternative social media. We have very little access to them. So most of them are encrypted, and getting data from these apps is almost impossible. So we have Discord, we have Telegram, and so many other ones that we know very little about. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if Rachel rejoined us, but I know, do we have any questions? I don't see any in chat at this point. I believe we're actually bumping up right against time. I can take over as MC for a second here. I've had my camera crash on me before, so I feel her pain. I believe we are just at time. So yes, Rachel did lose her internet, but thank you everyone for having us here. I would love to further have this conversation with these fellow panelists. I think there's a lot of work to be done here, and the more we can all collaborate together. I know as coming in here as the individual from a company, that this is somewhere where without, our team just wants to eat data and research all day, because without that, we can't know where to go look. We can't know what dark corners to shine a flashlight in. And honestly, at the end of the day, looking at it from a psychological standpoint, we want to support our community. We want to make sure they have a healthy, safe space, and also that they can express themselves if they're struggling, and finding a community here to hopefully maybe even deter them from turning the wrong way. So thank you again so much for this conversation. I'm going to turn this over to Miss Yolanda Gallego Casilda Grau. Hopefully I said all of that correctly. And thank you all again so much for the opportunity to have this dialogue today.
Perfect. Thank you as well. Looking for those conversations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you to the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism for inviting the European Commission to this expert roundtable on an important topic on which we have been working at the European Union intensively this year. We are convinced that multi-stakeholder approaches are the most efficient way forward, and we value very much this collaboration between the United Nations and the European Union in this regard. We approach this issue of the misuse of online video gaming through two avenues. One is the Radicalization Awareness Network, and the other one is the EU Internet Forum. Regarding the RAN, the Radicalization Awareness Network, this is a network of around 6,000 practitioners around Europe working on prevention of radicalization. And in the past year, the RAN has been raising awareness precisely among practitioners on the role of video gaming in the radicalization processes. The RAN also aims at empowering the gaming community to tackle the challenges related to the misuse of video gaming by violent extremists. And also, in addition, in the EU Internet Forum, we have also addressed this challenge this year. You may know the EU Internet Forum provides a collaborative platform for tech industry, law enforcement, international stakeholders, researchers, to address the challenges related to violent extremist and terrorist content online. And this year, we look into this issue in more detail. We organized a technical meeting on the 4th of October to establish the evidence base on the misuse of video gaming for radicalization by violent extremists. We discussed the topic, we identified challenges and potential solutions with representatives from more traditional video gaming companies to adjacent communication platforms, researchers, civil society, and law enforcement. Very briefly, I would like to share with you some of the insights of this experts meeting. And first of all, and I think we has already been mentioned today, the misuse is not limited to video gaming alone. Malicious actors, they use traditional video gaming platforms, adjacent communication platforms, social media simultaneously. They want to spread their message. So that is why we think that the broader online ecosystem makes necessary cooperation between different online service providers. And for this reason, we recently welcomed gaming adjacent online service providers as new members of the EU Internet Forum. Secondly, and this is a very worrying trend, has already been mentioned, there are very young users. I mean, children, minors that are radicalized and actively involved in extremist activity online. And the creation of violent extremist video games or modification of existing games, as well as the reference to pop culture, are part of a propaganda strategy resonating very well with young users. For instance, we look into the case of a very young user planning an attack in the video gaming adjacent space who was in contact with youngsters from other EU and non-EU member states. Which leads me to the third point that was looked into this expert meeting, was that violent extremist actors are not only connecting across platforms, but also across borders. And this is a challenge for law enforcement agencies, of course. These challenges include cross-border access to electronic evidence, but also cooperating with platforms during investigations, and also a bit the lack of knowledge of what data are being held by companies that can help to these investigations. Another important challenge we look into for companies is content moderation. We will currently discuss this in languages other than English, and automated identification of real life violence versus in-game violence. The modification of games and the reference to pop culture also demand a detailed knowledge of the specific community, slogans, symbols. And that is why in the EU Internet Forum, we are trying to support companies in their content moderation efforts, for example, through what we call a knowledge package that has been recently released on violent right-wing extremist groups, symbols, and manifestos. So looking ahead, the EU Internet Forum has identified two challenges to be addressed next year in relation to the misuse of video gaming. The first one is we will continue to support and empower the gaming community by facilitating the sharing of good practices and developing guidance, also with the involvement of the RAN. And secondly, in the EU Internet Forum, we will facilitate cooperation among law enforcement and companies to help to raise awareness, what type of data are being held by companies, and how to request and to facilitate access to electronic evidence. Last word on the protection of young users and children. We will continue, this will continue to be a priority for the EU, and at the upcoming EU Internet Forum Ministerial meeting, which will take place this week, we will discuss radicalization of young users online and explore how to best protect children in the online world, including in video gaming and adjacent spaces. So I will stop here. Thank you very much again for inviting the European Commission to this roundtable, and looking forward to continuing our joint efforts on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. And I just want to thank Yolanda for that introduction and framing, and to the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism for having me join to introduce section 2 of today's program and speak a little about how we're trying to encourage multi-stakeholder explorations into opportunities for more innovation in what we call PVE and CVE, or preventing and countering violent extremism, and really focused in on how we can find solutions based on policy approaches, programming support, and in some cases, tooling. To frame this, the Global Internet Forum to Counter-Terrorism, or GIFCT, is in a bit of a unique position, having been founded originally by tech companies for tech companies, but with multi-stakeholderism as part of its governance and programmatic model to get things done. Why is multi-stakeholderism and a multi-sector approach important? Well, often tech companies, particularly smaller companies or newer companies, but even some larger companies that don't necessarily have the background or are just being made aware of certain harms-based trends on their platforms, most tech companies do not have a really large in-house subject matter expert team specifically on nuances of terrorism and violent extremism. Often companies have a safety team that is under a huge amount of stress, having to cover every topic of harm, from bullying and harassment to wider hate speech, and this topic being just one of many. So each of our sectors really does have a role to play. Academics and expert practitioners have their finger on the pulse of adversarial shifts. Governments and law enforcement often better understand the offline trends and manifestations of threat that feed into the online space. And international bodies like the UN, the EU Internet Forum, G7, and others keep us focused on more global diversity and a more global perspective. White supremacy nuances online are going to look different to some of the Islamist extremism trends, Buddhist extremist trends, misogyny-based violent extremist trends, and tech companies really do understand how safety and content moderation tooling can work on their own platforms to help get to the scale and speed that is necessary to get to online actions once bad actor behavior is detected. So GIFCT, working directly with member tech companies and beyond, can help some of this developed cross-platform tooling or some of that knowledge sharing to get at terrorism and violent extremist trends online. As example, even basic things like hosting topical working groups or a hash sharing database to get at known terrorist content, and housing some crisis response protocols to work with tech companies and others are really important. But at the end of the day, the knowledge and understanding of adversarial shifts and trends is crucial to operationalize any of those tools, policies, and protocols. It is by our sectors working together and doing what we do best that we can better understand the threat and proactively detect and surface and then take appropriate actions to prevent real-world harm online. Gaming and radicalization is one of these newer nexus points of concern that has been increasingly gaining traction in the public space, but we need to understand the real trends and threats that do and also don't exist, as some of our previous speakers brought up. It is very rare to see games built directly by violent extremist groups themselves, and popular usage of those few examples where this has happened is quite low. It is almost never the case that some extremist agenda or radicalization towards hate-based violence is built directly into the infrastructure of larger gaming systems. However, bad actors do key off of popular cultural references from the gaming community. Recruitment is always a vulnerability in open chat platforms, as was discussed, and as we've seen through other social media case studies. And violent extremists will always try to evolve and try new ways and new spaces and avoid safety measures. And so the more we have those safety measures by design in place, the less they have the opportunity to exploit those places. This is about safety by design and understanding the real threat online. So I'm pleased to introduce this panel of experts to build out this conversation. GIFCT is also happy to have companies like Discord as members of GIFCT coming to the table to work proactively with other companies and stakeholders. We're also pleased to be a founding member of the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, who are part of these panels, EGRN, who have also developed research and reports on this topic, being featured with some open access through the Global Network on Extremism and Technology, or GNET. So you're in good hands for this discussion. I want to introduce our moderator, Dr. Jessica White, who is a research fellow at the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, Mr. Amjad Kazir, Director at Media Cultured CIC, Ms. Julia Ebner, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, Mr. Stefan Janssen, Digital Community Officer at the Radicalization Awareness Network, or RAN, and Ms. Bree Riggio, the leading trust and safety efforts at Discord. They will be discussing some of these large overarching themes on how all of society approaches can help safeguard against the exploitation of the gaming world and social media communication platforms. Big questions like how can games and the gaming community get more involved in preventing and countering violent extremism as an active and engaged online community? And what tools can we work with in this space, and how can we get bodies like the UN involved to help build upon existing digital resilience efforts? Big questions, and I'm happy to pass it over to our moderator, Dr. Jessica White, to start this conversation.
Thank you, Erin, for that great introduction, and thank you everyone else who's come before in the previous sessions. It's been an interesting event so far, I think, really covering some important issues. So as Erin said, I'm a research fellow, but I'm actually at the Royal United Services Institute in the Terrorism and Conflict team, and RUSI was one of 10 original organizations that formed the Extremism and Gaming Research Network. Several of others, along with Erin, you've already heard from today. And I just want to say quickly a few things about that network, because as a network, we aim to sort of put together our individual research organizations and the strengths that we have in order to investigate many of the questions that have been raised today about gaming and extremism. And I think it's important to understand, why and how these games are being used in order to inform what needs to be done in order to safeguard individuals, and sort of what policy and programming can be developed to support protection of gamers from the spread of extremism content in their spaces and to counter extremism within gaming communities. And in order to address some of these ideas, this session will be exploring what gaming companies, what gamers, and what more whole of society can do generally to try and defend these spaces and to take positive action to keep these spaces positive for people as well. So I'm joined today by several colleagues, as Erin has introduced them, and I wonder if we could start with this question about really, how can an all of society approach collectively safeguard against the exploitation of integrated video game and social media communications platforms? I think this is a really interesting question. I wonder if, Amjad, if I can come to you first on this question.
Okay, and thank you to the UNOCT for inviting us to this expert panel today. It's a very interesting question. How can video games be protected by misuse from extremism? I think it's an obvious one to say that developers can do more, but my take on this would be to focus on gaming culture rather than games per se, and gaming culture just a pastime, and gaming in of itself is about rewards. So how can effective CVE games, inverted commas, offer those same rewards? I think if we look at this as in the same way we do in terms of the challenge around racism and male toxicity and far-right linked hooliganism within soccer, will make far greater strides and avoid some of the mistakes that we've seen in sport around racism and extremism that are now decades old. So authorities in that space have, through their sloganistic messaging, for example, delivered anti-racism mantra, but less effective counter-narrative education and training programs. So in gaming, we could perhaps introduce more effective reporting apps. So any forms of racism, extremism, bullying, or harassment that might come to pass can be identified more accurately and addressed. And to do this, we must focus on effective counter-narratives and strategies that include a reward aspect within them. You know, we've got to think about the gamer. Will the gamer play a game which is preaching to them not to be a racist, or will they come there wanting to play a game that's A, about enjoyment, and secondly, find within that the capacity to want to report racism and extremism? So, as I think Amanat mentioned, apps will A, allow us to fill those gaps in knowledge and understand the gaming culture and the communities more, and understand that they are actually the solution and not the problem. And to build on the answer, it's probably most important to that we understand how counter-narratives are probably the most important but least well understood of the strategies we require to tackle extremism within gaming, whether it's the white supremacist or extreme far-right or pseudo-religious pull factors. We've got to remain true to enabling narratives that reject hate and have the similar appeal of those tones of us versus them. So where we see racist mantra laden with perceived grievances, we've got to have a clear and distinct difference in the kind of messaging that we see that draws people in. So just again, to be short, the counter messages must produce and reflect the nuances and intricacies of local and cultural and the reciprocation of the messaging that we're trying to deliver. And in short, gaming is a pastime. The apps that we report on and the policies and strategies that we design must allow for those within gaming who want to amplify a message that rejects it to have a stronger platform. So rather than games per se, let's focus on gaming culture.
Thank you. I wonder, Stefan, if you wanted to come in with anything sort of thinking about the all society approach and what we can do to try and protect these spaces. Would you have anything you'd like to say on that?
It's a really interesting topic. I think it's not the responsibility of one organization or one group. We need to do it all together. And if I look towards the Netherlands, I work for the Dutch police. We started a pilot called Gaming with the Police because we wanted to have a presence online in the gaming community. And we involve all other first-line practitioners, like youth workers, like schools, whatever has contact with these groups, we try to involve them. And I mean, mentioned one interesting thing, reporting possibilities. We spoke to several gamers, and we asked them, well, when you come in contact with radicalization or extremism, do you report those things, or what do you do with it? And we heard many say, well, we see it, but we'll click on, we ignore it and go further. But they never report those things. We asked them, why not? They said, well, where do I need to report it? Where can I offer this information? I don't want to call, for example, the police or call this or call that. It's too much effort. I just want to give the information a quick way and then be done with it. And that's what we're trying to do, for example, in the Netherlands, give them a platform online in the gaming world where they can drop their information and we can try to explore that information. So I think that's one of the most important things.
Thank you. I think that is a really important point. I wonder, Julia, if we could come to you and sort of continue this conversation about sort of how video games can be protected from misuse and from becoming, tools of this radicalization process. I think you probably would have something to add to that.
Yes, first of all, hello, everyone. I do think that gaming platforms and providers could do a lot more to prevent and disrupt the exploitation of their infrastructure and of their services for extremist purposes. And there are several points I'd like to make. One is that I would say that video game operators really have very different, widely varying approaches to fan-developed modifications, to mods. So some of them really are quite restrictive because of copyright concerns. Others are completely kind of free in terms of they allow all users to just create their own modifications, don't have any regulations surrounding that. So I think it would be necessary to really introduce laws that force gaming providers to introduce universal minimal requirements of due diligence to regulating the mods that users can create. So for example, that users that want to create a modification would need to get approval or can be fined for copyright breaches otherwise. And I think that should also include, for example, maybe even automatic mechanisms that don't allow them to systematically change the skin color, for example, of the protagonists or the or any of the video game characters, or also religious clothing, so that it can't be turned into something that is political violence or that is ideologically, basically ideological indoctrination. Because ideological indoctrination, we know that from research into rituals, into actually religious rituals, that ideological indoctrination often happens via repetition. So we know that, for example, from cults or from also extremist organizations, that this is how people are over time indoctrinated. And of course, video games really lend themselves to this kind of repetition of slowly leaking ideological elements into these games and thereby really radicalizing its users. And then another point I'd want to make, and that's really to underline what Erin Saltman also just said, and it also, of course, was presented in the findings of Amar and Linda, that it's not just about video games per se, but also about the gamification that happens as a gateway into extremism and as a gateway into radical communities. And I think here it's really necessary to understand the trends that are happening in this overlapping gaming extremism space, and to allow for better detection mechanisms and early warning systems that gaming providers and platforms can introduce, for example, to spot the early warning signs. And to really foster a closer collaboration with researchers that give them up-to-date insights into what the current codes and subculture references and insider vocabulary looks like in those spaces. And so that they can really identify attempts to radicalize communities on their platforms and in the chat functions even.
Thank you, Julia. Bria, we're coming to you last but not least, most certainly, just sort of as a Discord. I mean, I'm sure you have a strong perspective on what can be done in this space to protect misuse. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. Jessica, thank you for throwing the question my way. I mean, I think in general, right, we can think about games, whether there's modifications available in them or not. I think one good thing that game companies, gaming adjacent platforms can do is just assume that the game or that communities formed around a game are just going to be exploited by extremists. Of course, I mean, this becomes more true if players are going to have the ability to communicate with one another through the game, upload their own content to the game. But even if those features aren't there, we should go in with that assumption. A game becomes exploited because of the users who play it, first and foremost. Even games that give you little to no customization can attract extremist recruiters, extremist users if they gravitate to that game for whatever reason. I think if we go in with that assumption, then we can essentially plan for that reality as much as possible. As Dr. Saltman mentioned, this idea of kind of safety by design, this might mean developing policies around a game or around a gaming platform forbidding violent extremist content from being uploaded into the game. It might mean building out moderation tools and teams to be able to review and ban this content quickly. At Discord, for instance, we have a dedicated group of individuals within our trust and safety team, and they focus exclusively on taking down this kind of content. But they also are intending to learn about violent extremist communities, how these communities connect and communicate with one another online. The goal here is to have a team that can not only moderate the content, but then also recognize the patterns of behavior associated with these groups. Since a lot of time these groups are adversarial, they try and obfuscate what they're trying to do so that they can't get discovered and taken down. I would say, of course, this is all easier said than done. Having done the moderation work myself, it's not always clear cut where political opinions and extremist ideologies begin and end. There's also certainly concerns around user privacy that come up, especially when moderating proactively and trying to get at the content before it can reach a widespread audience. And then, of course, building effective moderation tools, it takes time, it takes company resources. But in general, I mean, just because these efforts are hard or costly doesn't mean that they should be delayed or ignored.
Thank you, Bria. I think you raise some good points there about this is the grayness of this space, right? It's a difficult space to navigate, giving people the right to expression, the right to their community without, without allowing the extremism in is a very difficult line to walk. I will remind everyone, attendees, please do throw some questions into the chat box. If you have any, they will be addressed in the next session. So I just want to switch tack a little bit here, because I think, sort of something that we've run across with the EGRN research that we've done so far is that you're never going to rid the gaming space of extremism, right? It's never going to be entirely gotten rid of. It will move from platform to platform as things get more difficult in certain spaces. So there's something to be said for how can we use gaming and gaming culture in a positive way, and rather than trying to get rid of all of the bad, encourage the good and encourage positive use of these spaces in order to try and negate that influence that extremism might have in these spaces. So I wonder if we could switch a little bit to this more positive end of this question and ask sort of, what about video games can be used to safeguard young men and women playing these games, and how can gamers themselves even take action to combat the presence of extremists, within their games or on platforms that they use? And Stefan, I wonder if we could come to you first, as you've been working on this sort of gaming with the police program, and tell us a little bit about that maybe in this space.
Of course, thank you. Well, we started it because we've noticed that a large group of the youth is going online, are not active on the streets anymore. And it was really a large world. There was no police presence, no presence of any other first-line practitioners, for the Netherlands at least. So we started it, and just to talk to the youth, to the gamers, talk to them, see what's happening online, see what kind of troubles they encounter. So not from come join the police, but just speak with them. And we've got really good comments from the gamers about what do you think we are online as police, as youth workers. What do you think of it? And they all say, well, it's an easy way for us from our comfort zone to talk to law enforcement, to youth workers, to therapists, whatever, and seek help. Or if they encounter something, for example, messages of hate, discrimination, it's an easy way for them to reach first-line practitioners to help them. And we actively involve those gamers. So we ask them, what can we do? But what can you do, and what can we do together? For example, one of the things that we created from this conversations is a project called Unite. We did about 17 or 18 live stream shows, every week one, where we had several topics that they told us, for example, radicalization, extremism, but also different variants of crime, online crime. We try to involve influencers to sit on the table and talk to them. For example, the COVID, we had a doctor in the Netherlands, Diederik Gommes. He told us something about COVID, the approaches of COVID, but he actively went into the conversation with the youth online and answered their questions. So I think it's really important to involve the youth, involve the gamers into the projects that we are trying to maintain and to develop.
Thank you, Stefan. I think that's a great point. Julia, I mean, I know everyone has something they want to say about this, but Julia, I'll come to you next. You're on mute, Julia.
Apologies, classical mistake. This is now still about safeguarding women and safeguarding vulnerable audiences, or is it already about what gamers can also contribute to that?
Either one, both.
Okay, because I think in terms of involving gamers, I think we're also really far away from exploiting really the full potential of this. I think it's really necessary to reconquer some of these gaming and trolling spaces that basically have been taken over in some of the cases by extremist subcultures, and that were initially meant for fun and entertainment. I think it was also mentioned in the introduction in Amar's presentation that, for example, incels and also some of the other spaces that have now turned radical, or have been mostly turned into radical subcultures, were initially meant for a completely different purpose. And the same is true for some of the gaming spaces, where actually quite a lot of the gamers are really frustrated and would be happy if they could somehow participate in some form of reshaping the discourse there and turning it into something that is closer to the original purpose of it, really entertainment and fun. And I think especially they should also be more encouraged. And I do think that Stefan Jansen here just really mentioned the best practice example of this, to do a form of online community policing, where they report any red flags they spot or any kind of, any dangerous and harmful behavior that is also jeopardizing the whole community as such. And I guess peer-to-peer campaigns could be really helpful here to also highlight the negative impacts that radical movements can have on the entire gaming space, because there are political consequences that all gamers are suffering from if some of the channels are removed, if some of the games are more restricted, and to really showcase that this is an exploitation that is happening here, and a manipulation that is driven by a set of extremist individuals that really harm the entire community and shouldn't be accepted by any of the gamers. And likewise, I do think that non-radical gamers who are also influencers on YouTube or on other channels should really make use of their platform to raise awareness about the exploitation of hobby communities like the gaming community. Same is true for the music, some of the music subcultures, for the mixed martial arts subculture, about the exploitation by extremist groups and what that incorporates in terms of the identity dynamics and the group dynamics that are at play here. So that they really can speak up against the radical voices and warn other young gamers.
Thank you, Julia. I wonder, MG, do you have sort of a perspective from what your organization does on this issue?
Absolutely, I think Julia just touched on a very important point, which sort of echoes what Ahmed spoke about gaming too. Ultimately, we talk about gaming as a community. Now, within that community, people are offered a sense of belonging and a sense of identity. So if we want to promote a culture within that community that rejects extremist narratives, who are our role models? If we want to empower women, for example, who are gamers, who have YouTube channels, as Julia has said, are we empowering them? Are we giving women a space in the development of games? So even if it's look at the sort of the abuse that was directed at women through, for example, Gamergate, the first and foremost step that we need to take is representation at the developer level, within the gamer level, within the influencer level, so we can encourage people to say, look, this is a community of people that ultimately, like wider society, rejects hate and extremism. So when we're looking for solutions in gaming design or gaming, we have wide inclusion processes too, but bottom-up lived experience contribution with top-down systems put in place to develop that sense of belonging and identity and community. And again, I must stress this, gaming is about rewards. So we have to include reward within our counter-narratives, within our gaming and within our design. We have to ask the question, as Stefan said, there might be reporting mechanisms there that are in part ineffective. But why should the gamer report it? Why should they? And I think role models and peers can encourage people to say, this is the kind of behavior that we reject. This is the kind of behavior that must be reported. And to have effective gaming culture that rejects extremism, be it through events or through the development of games, that's how we empower communities to deliver counter narratives in gaming that reject all forms of extremism. I think especially the development of games and the empowerment of women in that space is crucially important.
Thank you. Bree, I wonder if we come to you sort of, if you have thoughts on how video games can be used to safeguard these spaces, or how gamers can be used, positively as well.
Yeah, I think my comments would echo a lot of what my fellow panelists have said. I think one of the biggest actions that gamers themselves can take is to work together to build positive, inclusive communities and commit to protecting each other from bad actors who might be trying to infiltrate their group or radicalize their friends. Groups can build community norms around what kind of behavior is encouraged and supported, what kinds of behavior is unacceptable and disallowed in their games and their shared spaces. And then I think important to this is when individuals cross that line, whether it's accidental, whether it's deliberate, those behaviors need to be called out and not tolerated. When someone says something that's hateful or violent in nature, it's important to actually reject it. One thing that I would highlight is that, I think we know that the bystander effect is real. For many people, it might just seem easier to ignore something horrible when they see it or they hear it. There might even be a fear of being seen as political or being a troublemaker if you get involved. But by not explicitly denouncing hateful jokes or statements, I think a community runs the risk of sending a message that these kinds of jokes are tolerated, which then invites more of it. And eventually, at some point, those jokes, that dark humor, becomes more normalized in the community. They stop being jokes at some point, and then start to become real. To the point of thinking about how video games can be used to safeguard young people. I think as someone who has played video games for most of her life and has spent a lot of time around other gamers, I do think that video games have this really incredible power to generate emotional responses in people and sometimes even feelings of connectedness. And I think that this emotional activation is really key to thinking about how to answer this question. Games, particularly those that focus in some way on storytelling and characters, have this power to almost quite literally let you walk around in someone else's shoes. And from this idea, games can be used to help people learn about others who might be different from them or might have different lived experiences. They can be used to build empathy for others. And I think what we have found through research is that building out empathy is one of the most effective ways to protect against extremist ideologies taking hold in someone's mind. So I think there's something potentially powerful and resilience building there.
Thank you, Bree. So we're running short of time. Unfortunately, it's been really interesting, but I'm going to come around to everyone one more time with sort of a last question. You give me the speed answer, as we usually do at the end of these panels when we're running out of time. Bree, I'll come back to you first, just because we haven't gone to you first yet. But I wonder if we could just discuss really quickly sort of what next steps should include. What tools would be most effective in countering violent extremists in gaming and gaming-related platforms, and how these might fit into the larger UN initiatives such as we're discussing today, and the toolkits that might be developed to work in this space.
Yes. So thinking specifically about Discord, we have a wonderful team that focuses on building and delivering community moderations programs to our Discord moderators to try and teach how to build these kind of healthy, inclusive communities and spaces. That a program like that feels like the perfect home for any future programs that might be focused on building healthy communities and resilience to violent extremism. I could see a program where we take some of the teachings from the UN to incorporate some of the courses maybe offered through Connect and Learn to teach moderators how to create norms within their community, how to implement rules and moderation practices. That being said, I think, thinking big picture, no matter what tools or methods are being used for these endeavors, it's important, I think, to think about accessibility of the tools. Of course, the resources offered through the UN and through our Discord programs are fantastic, but they do rely on internet connection, on access to the internet. And so recognizing, not everyone around the world has easy access to the internet. It's important, I think, to meet people where they are, however we're building out these tools and resources.
Thank you. Stefan, can we come to you next?
I would think one of the most important things for me is try to involve all the parties, so first-line practitioners, researchers, gamers, youth, everybody and make one voice together, and try to make it easier for people to report the things that they see. So, for example, create a platform online in that gaming community or in the social media community where they can reach us and in their way, their easy way.
Thank you. I think that's a great idea. MG, can we come to you next?
Sure. I think I often take umbrage when I hear the word toolkit, especially within the diversity program. What does it mean? How is it going to be used? And just to echo what Stefan has said now, in a cross-societal approach, and again, I'll echo back to the rewards. For example, if we have a gaming event, a gaming competition, bring to that competition your parents, your teachers, and your positive gaming role models. And through that process, let's deliver that effective counter-narrative. Then when we hand these people a toolkit, they'll know what we're really talking about. And again, within that, it doesn't have to focus solely on extremism at this event. It can focus on misogyny, and it can focus on bullying and harassment. We work closely with schools, colleges, and football clubs, and we talk about safeguarding and education. More often than not, when we ask parents, do you know what Discord is? They'll shake their head. Do you know your child may have seen the footage out of New Zealand? They'll say no, and they'll be aghast. So we do have to bring that knowledge to the community, but it has to be done in a way which isn't just a PDF that they can download, because no one's going to read it. They've got to be invited to an event where they can play a game, feel some ownership of that event, and then deliver lived experience counter messaging. So that's my positive note to end on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Julia, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I mean, building on what already has been said in this panel discussion, I would really be in favor of more of closer partnerships, both between tech, I mean, also what Stefan Jansen said, I think between all the different stakeholders, but especially really using the role of influential gamers to foster partnerships with them to promote a better overall discourse within the gaming scene and better awareness among gamers in terms of what the grooming and manipulation techniques are of extremists. And then also fostering closer relationship with researchers who are looking into the trends in real time and can really update tech companies and provide us on a regular basis on what the most recent vocabulary lists and so on and insider codes are that they should look out for.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to everyone. I think there's been some great ideas talked about here and great themes raised about how we both protect these spaces and how we use them positively, and how gamers can be part of the solution to sort of keeping these to be positive community building spaces. So I think we're out of time, and I'm going to pass to Mr. Arthur Bradley, who is the Senior Intelligence Analyst at Technology Against Terrorism.
Thank you, Jessica, for the introduction. Thank you also to the UNOCT for organising this event, and to all speakers for their presentations. These discussions, super interesting and really kind of confirm a lot of what we're seeing at Tech Against Terrorism. We work on behalf of UNCTED to support the tech industry tackle terrorist exploitation of the internet whilst respecting human rights, with a particular focus on smaller tech companies, including those in the gaming scene, really with guidance of best practice in protecting their users and reputation. So I'm part of the open source intelligence team, really kind of working in primary sources to track and report terrorist and violent extremist content on gaming and game adjacent platforms, kind of particularly video sharing platforms, and also those with messaging app like features. Live streaming is also kind of a particular concern. I'm conscious that we're slightly up against it in terms of time, so I'm gonna dive straight into the questions. Just to reiterate, please do post any questions that you may have in the chat, and I will aim to address them all over the next kind of 10 minutes or so. So these questions are kind of for all panelists. I'm going to kick off with the first one. There's been a recent increase, of course, as been mentioned by some panelists, in the number of children and kind of youths being arrested for involvement in terrorism in the UK. And also kind of deliberate attempts by violent far-right organisations to attempt to recruit children. Certainly this has been happening in the UK, and the US and Europe. And of course, coinciding with this phenomenon has been kind of the increasing exploitation of gaming platforms by terrorists and extremists. So Kind of two questions here. What role does age and gender play in vulnerability to extremism in digital gaming spaces? And also, what role might gaming play in this trend of youth radicalization? So perhaps I can start off passing this over to Ms. Julia Ebner, perhaps.
I needed to unmute myself. What role can youth play in? I mean, it's already. I think we already spoke about this at the beginning of our panel session a bit. What in general civil society can do. I do think that in general there's a bigger role to play for people in the education space and in really raising awareness among young people and also in more peer-to-peer communication, because actually among young people sometimes they're even more aware of this than the digital natives are even more aware of some of the trends and dynamics than the digital migrants or the older generations. But I definitely think that topics such as what do online spaces, and I'm not just talking about gaming spaces, but I think also in general, what do online spaces do with us as individuals, with our identities, but also as groups? What are the group trends that they can give rise to, and as a society overall? These are really questions that we haven't addressed yet properly in educational settings, where I think there's a lot of potential to really look at the psychological aspects, not just looking at digital resilience or digital literacy when it comes to distinguishing between fake news and a piece of reliable source, but really looking into those deep psychological processes that are at play when we go into online groups and join maybe an exclusive online chat group and become a part of them.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a really important point. I'm just going to say, actually, I'm conscious of time, so it's going to be difficult for me to kind of address the questions to all panelists. So, but perhaps, given your background, Amjad Kazir, perhaps you have any extra comments on that one?
Yes, of course. Just I'll be short again. I think again when we talk about safeguarding young people and educating young people who are playing games, we have to focus on the enjoyment factor. They're playing a game. And how can we bring them to that game and then wrap around that game certain pedagogical processes and training for teachers, which there's a massive, if you look at the research, there's a massive gap in knowledge within teachers and parents in terms of what their kids are accessing online. And it's safe to say the same for YouTube, Facebook, or in gaming. So if we're going to address this issue, regardless of age, and deliver locality-specific training, I talked about in one of my answers, those intricacies and those nuances in terms of delivery and where that delivery is made. We have to focus first and foremost on gaming, not the game, but gaming, and start that at every age. We can run competitions for lower age schools, then senior schools and colleges, and through positive role models and peer-led processes, we can encourage communities to reject it, be it online or on the street. So that's where I'd start. It sounds like a big challenge, but I don't believe it is if there's enough of us willing to do it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So onto the kind of moderation side, famously, platforms are facing increasingly complex tasks, staying on top of terrorist and extremist content. And, there's not much debate around the removal of content that might be produced by kind of designated organizations, widely designated organizations. But there's also a growing category of what you might call kind of gray area content, which might be a bit more subjective. With this in mind, how can we ensure that online monitoring and moderation of digital spaces is human rights compliant? Perhaps, Bree Riggio, this might be a good one for you.
Yes, absolutely. I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, I think in general, first, I mean, as you mentioned, there isn't really a lot of debate on what should be taken down in lots of cases or what particular groups we should be monitoring. I think one thing that moderation teams can do, though, is to stay on top of trends, stay on top of research, stay connected to what academics and journalists and companies, peer companies, are doing and seeing, and whenever possible, kind of share best practices and share information. Of course, there's a lot of incentive or disincentive structures rather set up to not necessarily make that an easy process, but whenever possible, I think that's something that should be used. Thinking about human rights specifically, I mean, I think that, you know, working with organizations and looking to organizations that have done work in this area and making sure that, you know, when policies are written out, when moderation efforts are being constructed, to always, you know, follow best practices, bring in expert opinions to help make sure that you're not inadvertently setting up systems of governance or systems of moderation that are inadvertently going to harm some of the most vulnerable populations in society. I mean, I think going in with that kind of mentality, going in with that intention, can do a lot to then, when you actually put action into practice and build out your systems and policies from there.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And then finally, we have a question on reporting bounties, and I know that Dr. Alok has replied to this in the chat, but wondered whether you could expand a little bit more. Are reporting bounties, so skins, items, etc., ever offered to induce gamers to report extremist recruiting?
So I think the challenge here is that there are a lot of great ideas, like, you know, so what we want to do is incentivize reporting, right? I think one of the challenges with the gaming community is that a lot of them are like huge trolls, and try as we might to implement some, you know, desire to create like a good thing, and it oftentimes gets perverted or steered away. And I think that's just one of the challenges that we face in the technological world. I think it could be a really interesting idea. It's just, I'm imagining some of the people that I play games with, and if I can get a skin or other cosmetic, which has to a certain degree monetary value for reporting someone, I'm gonna report them right and left, right? And so I think that it's so challenging. And it's just one of the things that's you know, makes this problem so complex.
Absolutely, and actually I can see Bree, you've chipped in there. Do you want to add anything to a comment?
Sure. Yes. I mean, I can't help but coming at things from the trust and safety harm perspective, right? And I think just one other thing that I would want to say is that we also want to be very wary when thinking about reward systems like that. Wouldn't want to build something or incentivize users to deliberately putting themselves in harm's way, right? To go and maybe convince them or incentivize them to infiltrate extremist communities just to gain these rewards, because the consequences of getting into those communities and getting your information out to those individuals has some very serious real world consequences sometimes.
Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, I'm going to thank again to all audience members and panelists for their questions and answers. I'm going to pass over now to Mr. Mauro Miedico, Deputy Director of the UN Counter-Terrorism Center and Chief of the Special Projects and Innovation Branch of the UNOCT, for closing remarks. Mr. Miedico, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Arthur, and thanks to all. It is really a great pleasure just to, first and foremost, thank you all really for the keen participation in this, I would say, even exciting expert roundtable on video games and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Let me try to summarize some of the key points as I have been hearing throughout the discussion. The first point I want to make is that, as all discussions have highlighted today, there is clearly great interest and really a need for a very comprehensive approach to counter this threat jointly. The second point is clearly to understand the risks. And all of the speakers have really indicated that we face a reality where the digital gaming environments have at least the potential to support terrorist and violent extremist activities. And both video games and gaming adjacent platforms are really increasingly used to propagate ideology of extremist content and certainly disseminate terrorist propaganda. And we have seen this even increasing during the COVID-19 pandemic due to the increasing time spent on the internet. And this has clearly created a situation that extremists can and are exploiting. So we really need also to look at any possible effort to safeguard any digital space. And of course, this includes the video game community for any possible abuse or misuse. The third point that clearly emerged, at least in my understanding of the discussion, is the need to push and continue more research. We have certainly, through the event today, we have expanded our awareness of this threat, and certainly we have done so by bringing different stakeholders into this expert roundtable. And our own research team this morning did really an exceptional job, I have to say, of summarizing all of the existing research for us and highlighting the knowledge gaps that would require further exploration or research. So our convened group of expert panelists is there, and we will further explore motivations behind terrorist misuse of gaming platform, but also the psychology behind these methods. And these are certainly behavioral insights that can and should assist us in better understanding the phenomenon, and so that we can tailor our response to the specific threats and risks and be more effective in the safeguard of such space. The fourth point is certainly the absolute need of a all of community response. And I would really like to stress the need not to demonize by any means video games or the video game culture per se, which is great, but instead really recognize the growing problem and come up also with very effective and I would even say smart solutions. This certainly requires partnership across all sectors, with the government, with national authorities, but also with the developers, the managers of gaming and gaming platforms, with legislators and parliamentarians, with civil society, but also far and foremost with subject matter experts, as we have learned today that the threat is real, and we need to tailor any response in order to get the outcomes be more tangible and impactful. The gaming and gaming adjacent platform have clearly turned into social media sites where all users basically discuss everything from their favorite music to any political ideology. And as such, we cannot really limit safeguarding the gaming related content only. We have to have a more comprehensive approach. And the last point, and the fifth and last point I wanted to raise is related to what I said in the need of, when I referred to the need of a whole of community responses, we need, and this is critical for our success, we need really to contextualize the response. For instance, we learned today that preventive measures on Twitch may look very different from those on Steam or Discord. And in fact, this is true because there is not one single gaming community, but many different, sometimes overlapping. They have different communities even on same very platforms. And any approach needs really to be tailored. And of course, it needs to be human rights compliant, gender sensitive, age appropriate, and consider all kinds of diversity in all its forms. We need to know more about the protective factors at play in the gaming community. And we have to conduct this in a manner that is compatible with the video gaming community and all of the different subcultures in order to yield effective and impactful results. So for us, it is critical that we continue cooperation with members of the gaming community. And while our discussion today produced certainly a great insights into the knowledge gaps that we have, of course, we need to proceed further, and we need to further develop these insights and reinforce our possible approaches by empirical data and research. So as I mentioned, research is critical. We need perhaps even to do more research in neuroscience or in aggressive thoughts, in a behavioral insight related to video games, more research in investigating even all of the theoretical, empirical, or experimental case studies just before drawing any policy conclusion that would address the violent games and the effect they may have on the individual and his or her behavior. And so we really strive to ensure to incorporate all these perspectives, and we will certainly attempt at ensuring to offer always well-rounded and evidence-based capacity building support to all of our beneficiaries, starting of course with the governments, but also beside any governmental entity. Let me therefore, just in conclusion, really thank first of all of you for all of your time. Certainly, I want to thank our incredible moderators, if I may, Dr. Rachel Cowart and Dr. Jessica White, for really guiding so widely our panelists and guiding the very rich dialogue and insights. Let me thank also our UNOCT researchers, Dr. Amarnath Amarasingam and Ms. Linda Schlegel, whom we wish all a very speedy recovery, for also giving us a very thorough review of the existing knowledge. I want to thank, of course, all of the great panelists, the very diversified perspective from academia, from civil society, from the private sector. Thank to you all for the wonderful thought-provoking questions and participation that really allowed you, Arthur, Mr. Bradley, to also conclude this last Q&A session. So we will certainly be taking all the information gathered today and build on it through continued research and through more strategic approaches. We are committed to leading on joint international responses to this threat. And that, just as the next step, we will certainly organize a high-level event in early 2022, so that to involve more even of the policymakers into this discussion. So just please stay tuned, and we look forward to our continued engagement. Again, thank you all. Thank to particularly Ms. Laila Ezarki, Chief of External Partner Reception, and all of the fantastic team for putting this together, and wishing everybody a very safe and happy holiday season. Thank you very much. Meeting closed.